The Yellow Tooth Adventure. Chapter 7.
The three met aboard the Bradley and decided to investigate the Epsilon Beta system, a binary system with 7 planets, 3 moons, and an asteroid belt. The 15 to 45 degree system had worked successfully before. They would use it again. At UL-10, it took about 10 hours to reach the first star, Epsilon Beta 1, and its 4 planets. EBI-1 was a ball of molten iron close to the star, no need to investigate it. EBI-2 was a planet shrouded in ammonia clouds. An investigation would be a quick sensor scan, but nothing was found. EBI-3 was a Mars-like planet. Their investigation found 3 large underground caverns. The caverns seemed to house some life, technology, and high-energy emissions. However, there did not seem to be any communication between the caverns. The caverns were a great depth below the surface, so sensor readings were sketchy at best. It was decided that the Confederation would investigate the northernmost cavern, the Bradley would investigate the southernmost, and the Constitution the central cavern. David rallied his forces, 100 crewmen, and split them into 2 details, 30 security crewmen and 20 volunteers each. Chief Briggs led the 1 detail, Alpha Team, and David led the 2nd detail, Beta Team. The teams would be teleported into opposite sides of the cavern to work their way to the center, investigating buildings, caves, and depressions. As the teams teleported in, the first thing they saw was a bright globe on the roof of the cavern, giving the cavern light and warmth. After that, they saw no sentient beings as they crept around objects, investigating buildings and caves. It seemed that this was an automated facility waiting for its masters. Finally, the 2 teams met in the center and, comparing notes, concluded that the cavern was indeed waiting for someone. However, the Constitution teams found a prison hidden in the cavern. Upon investigating the prison, they found Commodore Bluetail and his crew in 1 large cell, and in a 2nd large cell, they found Captain Snippet Grove and his crew. David told Chief Briggs to hold everything for the moment and teleported back to the Constitution and then to the Confederation. David told the Admiral what he had found. "Admiral, both of your ship's crews are held prisoner, a whole crew in 1 cell. They are starving. We have 2 crews to care for." The Admiral recalled his Marines and teleported down to the cavern with his Marines and David. The crews were freed and teleported to the Bradley, the Confederation, and the Constitution, where the prisoners were fed, cleaned up, and checked out by the medical personnel. Commodore Bluetail and Captain Snippet Grove reported to the Admiral everything that had happened to them and their crews. After caring for the prisoners, a meeting was held aboard the Confederation, and it was decided that the 3 ships should hide in the asteroid belt for some time to see whether the masters of the caverns might return.
O'Reilly put together a buoy to monitor the planet and alert the 3 ships when any ship would enter the star system. The buoy would record the sensor readings and provide data on whatever triggered the buoy's sensors. Larry reasoned that if the wrecked Krill battlecruiser was attacked by another Krill battlecruiser, maybe we should recheck the caverns for another prison. We might find a Krill crew. The Admiral roared as no one had ever heard before.
"Recheck all 3 caverns. Investigate every inch. Sensor sweep for Krill life signs."
David returned to the Constitution and tasked Tasha with taking the 2 teams to search every inch of the cavern. The Bradley did much the same, and the Admiral sent his Marines. The 3 ships began a detailed scan of the planet for Krill life signs. The searches took many hours, and nothing was found. But just as the search was being called off, Catherine called David.
"Captain, I have found a feeble Krill life sign. The Krill must be a great distance from us."
David called the Bradley and the Confederation and coordinated a triangulation effort to locate the Krill.
The eventual location was in a small cavern deeper than the other 3 and would have to be entered on foot.
The entrance was found, and the Admiral's Marines, augmented by the security forces of the Bradley and the Constitution, entered the tunnel to the cavern. The Flying Major called the Admiral.
"Sir, the entryway is blocked. It looks like the enemy blew up the way in to trap whoever is in there."
The Admiral ordered.
"Clear that block any way you can without harming our people."
David ordered his shuttlecraft to go in and clear the blockage without hurting anyone. O'Reilly and his Bradley counterpart rigged the shuttle with something like a front-end loader. Tasha piloted the shuttle, digging many feet, having to return to the surface with load after load of dirt. With each loader full, a very close inspection of the tunnel had to be made to ensure that the shuttle would not be buried.
Tasha used the laser to fuse the tunnel walls and ceiling to shore up the tunnel. It was beginning to grow dark. Lights were set up to continue the work. After 8 hours, David relieved Tasha and spent the night moving the dirt. Taking the same precautions, Tasha took to maintain safety. After 8 hours, George relieved David, and after another 6 hours, they had a breakthrough. George piloted the shuttlecraft down to the Krill life signs. George jumped out of the shuttlecraft to vomit, retch, and vomit again. The Marines arrived and surveyed the situation. Most of the Admiral's Marines could only vomit and retch. After the Marines recovered some semblance of control, they began to carry the living Krill out of the cavern. David took a series of body bags down to begin to retrieve the dead. Looking, it was obvious that many Krill had been beaten to death, others had starved, and the survivors were on the very brink of death.
The ship's complement for a Krill battlecruiser was 320. David counted 297 dead. The bodies were placed in a second cryo chamber to preserve the dead for transport to the Krill home world, which left 23 Krill still living. The survivors were treated, fed, and allowed to rest and tell their stories. Meanwhile, the Admiral ordered that the 3 ships hide in the asteroid belt and see who returned to the caverns. Among the survivors was 1 officer, a lieutenant. As they waited, the Krill female ensign visited the survivors asking about their experience and others in the crew. When she visited the lieutenant, she recognized her brother. The two held on to each other, crying for joy to find they were still alive. Next, the Krill ensign asked to speak to the captain.
Captain,
She began to caress David's hand.
thank you for saving my brother.
She continued to caress his hand, just silently weeping.
Finally, David touched her appendage. You're very welcome, Ensign. You may return to your brother. Hiding in the asteroid belt with the buoy that O'Reilly had constructed, the 3 ships waited. 10 days in, and the alarm alerted the crew. It was a spiral ship, like the one that had attacked in the wormhole. Having encountered this type of ship before, David Burst transmitted what he had learned from his encounter with the one before. The spiral ship commenced landing on the planet near the entrance to the northernmost cavern. As they watched, the spiral ship's crew began to exit the ship. The crew looked nothing like what David had seen before during his moment with these people. Krill, Fleising, Archons, and humans were disembarking from the ship. They seemed to be friendly to one another. David could only wonder, but then as David and his crew watched, the crew began to unload Fleisings, Krill, Archons from the bowels of the ship.
The crew seemed to be using something like cattle prods to get the prisoners to move along. Then the spiral ship began to bore into the ground. After about an hour, the prisoners were herded down into the tunnel the ship had made. The spiral ship's crew exited the tunnel and there was a great blast belching out of the tunnel mouth, and the Admiral roared.
Blast those. Untranslatable. Give them everything we've got. Then we're going to need that special shuttlecraft, friend David.
1 hyperspace torpedo and the spiral ship disappeared, and many of the crew as well. Lasers ended any resistance that might have been put up. And the Admiral's Marines took those that remained alive in custody for interrogation. Tasha took the shuttlecraft down and began the task of digging out the tunnel that had been blasted shut. The Admiral teleported down, sat on a stool, and interrogated the surviving members of the spiral ship. He began with the Fleisings, then the Krill, the Archons, and the humans. Finally, the Admiral stood, called a Fleising to stand before him, and asked his questions. When the Fleising refused to answer, the Admiral shot him. Then he called for the next Fleising and questioned it, and on refusing to answer, the Admiral shot him. Finally, David questioned the Admiral, and the Admiral bellowed out,
I am the policeman. I am the interrogator. I am the judge, jury, and executioner.
Suddenly 1 Archon stood up, shaking, and began to answer the Admiral's questions, the whos, the whens, the wheres, the whys, and the hows. They were a band of interstellar pirates. The Archon had originated the eclectic band of ruthless creatures without pity, without morals, and with malice aforethought, robbed, destroyed, and murdered victims of any race that had what they might desire. They robbed and pillaged civilian ships, weaker military ships, villages, towns, and small cities, raping, killing, and destroying.
The surviving ship's crews were buried alive. When asked about the spacers found in the cells, the Admiral was told that they, the pirates, had simply not gotten around to it yet. Tasha had begun digging the block tunnel. 8 hours later, George took over the job, and then 8 hours later, David relieved George. 6 hours into his shift, David broke through to the prisoners. He stepped out of the shuttlecraft and started to vomit, retch, and vomit some more. Finally, when he could control himself, he helped 3 survivors into the shuttle and returned to the surface. David reported to the Admiral that about 150 bodies were in the tunnel, all beaten to death. The Admiral ordered his Marines to march the pirate crew into the tunnel and then detonated a bomb to seal the tunnel completely. David and Larry spoke to the Admiral. "Sir, we have to take our survivors home. We have exceeded our capacity of passengers."
The Admiral admitted that they had accomplished their mission, rescuing Commodore Bluetail and his crew and Captain Snippet Grove and his crew. But after delivering their passengers, he wanted to return and end the piracy. So the 3 ships traveled to Flysinga and delivered their Flysing passengers, then on to the Krill home world to deliver the Krill survivors and the dead bodies stored in their cryo chambers. Before leaving the ship, the young Krill ensign and her brother asked to speak with the captain. She reached out and began to caress David's hand.
Captain, you have been so kind. May I know your name? I want to remember you and perhaps, one day, repay you.
David smiled, touched her appendage, and replied, "My name is David Stevens. May I know your name?" She replied,
David Stevens. David Stevens, my name is Clarice, Ensign Clarice. Thank you so very much, Captain David Stevens. God go with you.
Then she and her brother left the ship.
There was only one thing to do: report to Admiral Marovich everything they had experienced, and ask to rejoin Admiral Yellowtooth in putting an end to this pack of pirates. The Admiral assigned the Constitution and the Bradley to assist Admiral Yellowtooth in eradicating the pirates. Reporting back to Admiral Yellowtooth, plans were made to return to the Epsilon Beta system, hide in the asteroid belt and wait for however long it takes to capture the remaining pirates. O'Reilly's buoy had been left behind, recording traffic in the system and alerting the Constitution, Bradley, and the Confederation. As the 3 ships traveled to the Epsilon Beta system, there had been no alerts from the buoy, but as they approached EBI-3, the buoy sent an alert. From the telemetry, David noted that 2 ships had entered the Epsilon Beta system, heading for EBI-3. David cautioned the other ships that these ships might be alerted by the mounds of dirt that they had left when rescuing the survivors from the tunnels. They had better go with shields up, ready to fight to the death. With these words, the Admiral roared, what could only be called a challenge to fight to the death. Never give up, never surrender. Then the crews of all 3 ships laughed and shouted to the death. As the 3 ships entered the system, their sensors detected the 2 ships on the ground. One of the 2 ships had been Captain Snippet Grove's heavy frigate. The second ship was a Krill battle cruiser. Sensors detected a large number of life forms in the northernmost cavern. The Admiral ordered, destroy those ships. David ordered 2 hyperspace torpedoes to target the 2 ships, and the 2 ships disappeared. Immediately, all 3 ships sent their Marines and security forces into the cavern to round up and detain the pirates in the cavern. Unfortunately, the ship's destruction had alerted the pirates, and a gunfight ensued. Watch any high-energy movie, and you might begin to understand the intensity of the battle in that cavern. The augmented Marine force stood at 300, but the pirate force numbered well over 800 of the most ruthless pirates you could imagine. After an hour of continuous battle, 100 Marine force members were replaced by fresh fighters with fully charged weapons. In another half hour, another 100 of the good guys were replaced, then another 100. The wounded were teleported to the appropriate shipboard medical facility and were replaced immediately. The good guys were rotated 5 times before the pirates finally surrendered. Weapons completely expended, and physically exhausted, they threw up the white flag and stepped out into the open. Still, the Marines were unconvinced, so patrols were sent to reconnoiter the cavern. Messages went to the ships to find the sensor data about the cavern. 462 survivors surrendered, and 209 dead bodies were counted.
Simple math suggested that 129 or so pirates remained at large. The good guys were given coordinates of life signs, and they captured 93 additional pirates. There were still 36 to find. The Marines herded the captured pirates out of the cavern and teleported them to the cavern with the large cells and imprisoned them. As the Marines were about to re-enter the northernmost cavern, they were recalled to the ships because the buoy had alerted them of an incoming ship. This incoming ship was a Flysing heavy frigate. The transponder identified it as Commodore Bluetail's ship. The admiral turned to the Commodore and asked,
Commodore, would you like to command the fleet to retrieve your ship?
Blue Tail considered his superior.
Yes, sir, I would like that very much.
The admiral roared.
Commodore, you have the con!
David and Larry had agreed that the Commodore deserved this honor. The Commodore commanded,
When my ship lands, let us land beside it, surrounding the ship and imprisoning the pirate crew.
This surprising strategy was completely successful. After landing, the Commodore hailed his ship.
This is Commodore Blue Tail, surrender or be blown to smithereens. Exit your ship one at a time, hands or appendages up over your head, and submit to a search.
Quietly, slowly, one at a time, the pirates exited the ship as the Commodore had ordered. The augmented Marine force searched each pirate, and they were led away in chains. When the pirates had exited the ship, the Marine force searched the entire ship, and command of the ship was returned to the Commodore. With a minimum crew, he flew the ship to Flysinga to report to the Flysinga High Command. The admiral then ordered that all surviving pirates be taken to Flysinga to stand trial for interstellar piracy. The admiral mentioned the missing 36 pirates as being of no consequence.
They were trapped on a desert world with no ship, no one caring, no hope, except radioing their complete and unconditional surrender. David and Larry saluted the admiral and asked permission to return to Sector 00 for shore leave.